Imagine an elderly gentleman just bursting into a psychiatrist's office in the early 1900s. He is completely frantic.
Oh, yeah, like full-blown panic.
Exactly, because his cash box is missing over 100 francs, and he suspects the thief is the 18-year-old boy who lives with him, his own ward.
Right.
But he doesn't have, a single shred of physical evidence. And he is absolutely terrified of a police scandal. I mean, he wants to spare the boy's respectable family from all that public shame.
Which makes sense for the time.
Totally. So he makes this rather extreme demand of the psychiatrist. He actually begs the doctor to hypnotize the boy and extract a confession while the kid is under.
Right, because the Guardian was basically looking for a magical shortcut to the truth. I mean, treating this brand new emerging field of psychiatry like it was some kind of dark art of mind control.
Yeah, like a magic trick.
Exactly. But the doctor, to his credit, firmly refused the hypnosis request. He viewed it as just a parlor trick that really had no place in serious medical practice. But he did offer a completely different solution, one that would, well, end up making history.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are opening up the archives of early 20th century forensic psychology. I am so glad you are joining us for this one.
It is a really fascinating era.
It really is. Our mission today is to examine two clinical documents from the early 1900s that capture the birth of what was called the psychological diagnosis of facts. We're going to look at how these early psychiatrists grappled with uncovering hidden truths.
Yeah, and navigating that incredibly messy intersection of, mental illness, criminal justice, and morality.
Right. We will explore two cases today. First, an early precursor to the lie detector used to catch a teenage thief. And second, the completely bizarre case of a serial swindler named Mrs. Z, whose actions sparked a really fierce debate over the legal definition of insanity.
It's quite the lineup.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. So the doctor refused the hypnosis, but he still had a suspected teenage thief to catch.
Right, so he proposed a psychological trap, and it was brilliantly disguised as just a routine medical appointment.
Sneaky.
Very. The teenager had previously mentioned wanting to consult a doctor for some mild nervous troubles, so the psychiatrist instructed the Guardian to bring the boy in for a standard consultation for these nerves.
Just a totally normal checkup.
Exactly. But he promised the Guardian that during this seemingly normal exam, he would find out if the boy was actually the thief.
I am fascinated by the mechanics of this trap. I mean, how does a doctor in the early 1900s extract a confession from a Guardian teenager without using hypnosis or like a police interrogation?
Well, he utilized a word association experiment. Now, to be fair to the historical timeline, the doctor in our source material didn't invent the concept of word association. Pioneers like Francis Galton and Wilhelm Wundt developed the foundational experiment. But this specific doctor, who was representing the famous Zurich Clinic alongside a colleague named Ricklin, he utilized a groundbreaking new framework. They called it the feeling-toned complex.
Okay, that phrase, feeling-tone complex, sounds very, very clinical. Let's break down what that actually means for the teenagers sitting in that exam room.
So the methodology was deceptively simple. The doctor prepared a standard list of 100 stimulus words. The patient is instructed to apply to each word as quickly as possible with the very first word that comes to mind.
Oh, okay, like a rapid-fire game.
Exactly. But hidden inside that long, mundane list of words were critical traps, specific terms that were intimately related to the details of the missing cash box and those stolen francs.
Right, so it operates like a psychological tripwire. You're walking through a field of totally normal words, like the doctor says apple, you say tree, he says sky, you say blue, and your brain is just tossing back the first association with zero effort. Your conscious defenses are completely lowered because the rhythm is so fast.
Right, you're just in the zone.
But then, out of nowhere, the doctor drops a word like cash box.
Yeah.
Like a 1900s cognitive truth serum.
And when that critical word hits, if you are guilty, it strikes that feeling-toned complex.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The brain of the guilty teenager instantly connects the word cash box to the memory of the theft, the emotional intensity of that secret.
The fear, the guilt, all of it.
Right. The adrenaline surges. His unconscious brain immediately tees up words like stolen or money or hidden.
But his conscious mind suddenly slams on the brakes because the teenager realizes he is about to incriminate himself.
Exactly.
He has to suppress that immediate truthful association and frantically search his vocabulary for a neutral word. He has to say something harmless like metal or heavy.
And that internal censorship, that frantic search, it takes time. It causes a measurable delay in reaction time, sometimes lasting several seconds.
That is brilliant.
It really is. Or, in his panic, the patient might just blurt out a highly unusual, completely nonsensical word association. The emotional weight of the feeling tone complex completely disrupts the normal cognitive flow,
And the doctor's just sitting there.
just quietly measuring these hesitations and anomalies.
So, the boy comes in for his fake nerve consultation, completely unaware he is stepping into a cognitive minefield. The doctor runs the 100 words. What happens?
The results were undeniable. I mean, the boy's associations explicitly revealed the theft complex. His reaction time spiked dramatically on the critical words.
Wow.
The hesitation, the awkward word choices, the data just painted a glaring picture of guilt. So the doctor reviewed the results, turned to the young man, and stated with absolute confidence, "You have been stealing."
And the teenager completely crumbles. The source describes him turning pale, sitting completely nonplussed for a moment, and then just breaking down into tears and confessing to the entire theft. The tripwire worked perfectly.
It was a massive victory for the psychological diagnosis of facts, because it proved that a structured clinical experiment could bypass a subject's conscious defenses.
Right, to establish objective guilt without any coercion.
Exactly.
Now, reading through this triumph in the source material, I was completely blindsided by a sudden detour the author takes. Right in the middle of explaining this groundbreaking scientific victory, the text descends into an incredibly petty academic turf war.
Oh my goodness, yes, it is so funny. The author takes an entire paragraph to vent his frustrations about two other researchers.
Wertheimer and Klein.
Right, Wertheimer and Klein.
Yeah.
Apparently, these two published an article in an archive for criminal anthropology where they kind of postured as the discoverers of this diagnostic method.
Well, I bet that went over well.
The author is absolutely furious. He emphatically points out that Galton and Wundt invented the experiment, and the feeling tone complex is the strict intellectual property of the Zurich Clinic.
He practically scolds them.
He does, for not having the decency to cite the workers who came before them.
It is oddly comforting to know that the founding figures of modern psychiatry were still, totally susceptible to academic jealousy and footnote battles.
Oh, definitely. Humans are humans.
Right. So the word association test was a brilliant mechanism for catching a thief. But knowing who committed a crime is really only half the battle. The word association test can solve the who.
Right.
But the much harder question, the one that really fractured the psychiatric community a few years later, is what happens when the who is already entirely obvious, but the psychological why is a complete chaotic mystery.
And that shifts the burden of the diagnosis of facts from simply finding the guilty party to determining if that guilty party is legally and morally responsible for their actions.
Enter Mrs. Z. This second historical case from our sources is just a labyrinth of deception. Mrs. Z was a serial swindler. Look at the sheer scale of her frauds for a second.
It's extensive.
She conned 2 women out of 200 marks. She defrauded another individual out of 4,000 francs, and yet another out of 700 francs.
And her method was remarkably consistent across the board.
Right. She would approach these victims claiming she held a winning ticket for the Hungarian state lottery. Sometimes she referred to it as the Budapest lottery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she claimed this ticket had drawn a staggering prize, up to 270,000 francs.
Which is a fortune back then.
A massive fortune. She told her marks that she just needed a little bit of upfront cash to pay her ticket agent, a man she called August Baumann, in order to secure the winnings.
Of course.
And once Baumann was paid, she promised everyone would share in the massive payout.
I mean, it is the 1904 equivalent of an advance fee scam. It operates on the exact same psychological hooks as a modern phishing email promising you millions from a foreign prince.
Totally.
The mystery for the authorities wasn't whether she took the money. I mean, she absolutely did. The mystery was her bizarre, relentless behavior regarding this imaginary ticket agent, August Baumann.
Because the authorities conducted exhaustive inquiries. They really did their due diligence. They checked registries, followed trails, interrogated contacts.
And
they could not find a single shred of proof that August Baumann existed. He was a complete phantom.
wow.
Yet, whenever she was confronted by the police or the magistrates, Mrs. Z defended Baumann's existence with shocking stubbornness. She would break down in hysterical tears, insisting he was real and that she had literally given him the victim's money.
And she was so genuinely distraught during these interrogations that the legal authorities actually hit pause.
Right.
They couldn't tell if they were dealing with a calculated mastermind criminal or a woman suffering from profound pathological self-deception who actually believed the lies coming out of her own mouth.
It's a tough call.
So they turned to the medical community to determine her legal responsibility. And the psychiatrists completely fracture over how to categorize her. We get two incredibly contradictory psychiatric opinions.
Right. Let's look at Opinion A. This was delivered in November of 1904. Now, it is important to note that Opinion A was based entirely on existing court documents and written records.
Because the asylum was deemed too far away to conduct an in-person examination.
Right. Exactly. So, relying just on those files, Opinion A concluded that Mrs. Z possessed an hysterical character.
Now, we should probably clarify that in 1904, the term hysteria was a heavily utilized, often heavily misapplied umbrella term.
Oh, absolutely.
It was primarily aimed at women and used to describe a vast range of emotional dysregulation or inexplicable behavior. Opinion A leaned heavily into this label. They concluded that her obsession with Baumann was a true pathological self-deception. They really believed her disease made her think he was real.
Right. And based on that, Opinion A declared she had partial responsibility for her crimes. Their logic really rested on the idea that constitutionally hysterical people habitually invent stories.
Okay.
The disease basically strips away the normal cognitive checks and balances that prevent an average person from lying and cheating. Because the disease compelled her to lie, they argued she could not be held fully accountable by the law.
So a few months go by, and the examining magistrate requests a second evaluation. Opinion B is delivered in March of 1905. And unlike the first group, the doctors behind Opinion B spent several months observing Mrs. Z directly in an asylum setting. Their conclusions about who she was were vastly different and, frankly, much harsher.
Way harsher. Opinion B dug deeply into her personal history and found a pattern of what they termed crass egotism.
Crass egotism. That is a phrase.
They documented a history of her swindling her own husband and her fiancé. They described her as hopelessly pleasure-seeking, extravagant, and operating with absolutely no moral restraints.
Basically, they painted a picture of a ruthless, morally defective psychopath who left a trail of financial destruction everywhere she went.
They did. They acknowledged all of this terrible behavior. They admitted she was an absolute menace to society, but their final conclusion took a massive leap.
Okay, what was it?
Opinion B argued that all of these lies, all of these calculated frauds, were simply symptoms of her severe underlying hysteria. Because her crimes were symptoms of an illness, Opinion B declared her totally irresponsible.
Wait, they wanted to declare her legally insane.
Yes. They determined her condition was incurable because it was, baked into her personality, and they recommended permanent internment in a closed institution to protect society from her schemes.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because I have to push back hard on Opinion B's logic.
Go for it.
If a person exhibits crass egotism, swindles their own family, manipulates strangers out of thousands of francs to fund a lavish lifestyle, how does slaving the medical label of hysteria over that behavior magically absolve them of all moral responsibility?
Right.
That feels less like a medical diagnosis and more like a massive legal loophole. You're essentially saying bad behavior is just a symptom, so no one is ever guilty.
Well, you are mirroring the exact philosophical crisis that the author of our source document faced. He was called in to provide a third, pie-breaking opinion.
Oh, okay.
He had to look at the conflicting conclusions of Opinion A and Opinion B and find a way to disentangle Mrs. Z's cognitive state from her moral compass. And he agreed with your pushback.
He did.
He did. He completely dismantled the logic of Opinion B by drawing a sharp, fundamental line between a moral defect, which he defined as the literal absence of moral feeling, and the medical condition of hysteria.
So he argued that these are two entirely separate things that just happen to be coexisting inside Mrs. Z.
Yes. He introduced a critical distinction between quantity and quality.
Okay, break that down for us.
He explained that hysteria is a condition that determines the quantity of emotion. The effects are exceedingly powerful, unpredictable, and overwhelming.
But the hysteria does not determine the quality of the person experiencing those emotions.
Precisely the point the author made. The patient's underlying character determines the quality.
Right.
Hysteria never creates a moral defect out of thin air. If a soft-hearted, empathetic person develops hysteria, they do not suddenly morph into a calculating fraudster. They simply become a more emotionally volatile, easily distressed version of a kind person.
That makes total sense.
Right. But if a ruthless, morally vacant person develops hysteria, the illness merely amplifies their existing ruthlessness.
So hysteria is basically an emotional volume knob, not the radio station itself.
That is a great way to put it.
It is a broken volume knob stuck on maximum, but the music being broadcast out of the speakers is still Mrs. Z's own crass egotism and greed. The illness just makes her underlying tune louder and more chaotic.
That is an excellent way to visualize the author's theory. The illness amplifies the character, it doesn't replace it. And to test this theory, the author actually conducted a rigorous personal interview with Mrs. Z while she was in prison.
And during that interview, she completely gave the game away, didn't she?
She really did. She admitted that her most recent fraud was committed purely on purpose, strictly to obtain money for herself. She detailed a specific incident where she told a victim she had to travel to the town of K to pay Baumann for the lottery tickets.
Right. So she takes the victim's cash, travels to the town of K, and does not look for an agent. Instead, she goes on a massive shopping spree.
Yep.
She returns a few days later, loaded down with new clothes and expensive presents for herself.
Exactly. Baumann played absolutely zero part in that specific fraud, and she admitted it to the doctor. She knew exactly what she was doing. Yet, incredibly, even after confessing this, she sat in her prison cell, crying copious tears, stubbornly maintaining that Baumann was a real person.
The author actually notes in the text that she possessed an uncanny gift for play acting. She was so dramatic, so convincing in her distress, that doctors and magistrates were continually taken in by her wiles.
Oh, she's good at it.
Her hysterical volume knob was turned up so high, it masked the fact that she was playing a very calculated, manipulative tune.
And that led the author to finalize his tie-breaking opinion. He concluded that Mrs. Z has diminished or partial responsibility.
Okay.
He firmly stated that her crimes are rooted in her moral defect, her evil inclinations. She acts like a common criminal because she has the character of a common criminal. However, her hysteria does limit her responsibility slightly.
Now wait, how does he justify the partial limitation if he knows she's faking the motive? Like, if she knows what she's doing?
Because the overwhelming emotional moods generated by the hysteria prevent her from calmly reflecting and resisting those passing impulses the way a neurologically healthy person could.
I see.
Yeah, she has a genuine disorder affecting her impulse control, but she is still the one choosing to execute the elaborate frauds.
So what does this all mean? We arrive at this incredibly nuanced, beautifully argued psychiatric diagnosis. But it creates a massive, tangible problem for the justice system. Where does a partially responsible serial swindler actually belong? Does she go to a prison or does she go to an asylum?
And the source document pivots right here from clinical psychology into a passionate, almost aggressive debate about social policy.
Oh, yeah.
The author issues a stark warning against Opinion B's recommendation to lock Mrs. Z in an asylum permanently. He argues that if the legal system starts categorizing all moral defectives, the habitual swindlers, the manipulators, the pathological liars, as legally insane, the lunatic asylums of the country will become choked with common criminals.
He uses his own hospital, the famous Burghölzli Asylum in Zurich, as his primary evidence for this. He writes that adding just one more criminal of Mrs. Z's caliber to their wards would make the situation quite impossible.
He was fiercely protective of the asylum's therapeutic environment. He argued that mixing manipulative, fundamentally sane but evil criminals with genuinely mentally sick patients completely poisons the tone of the entire hospital.
Which makes sense. You have vulnerable people there.
Exactly. It destroys the institution's reputation. He uses incredibly vivid language, warning that respectable families would become terrified to send their unfortunate, mentally ill relatives into what he called the villainous hubbub of a criminal ward.
Villainous hubbub. You do not see phrases like villainous hubbub in modern medical journals, but it paints such a clear picture of the chaos a person like Mrs. Z brings into a space designed for healing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is drawing a hard boundary to protect his profession. He is telling the legal system, hey, doctors must not let the asylum become the executive organ of criminal law.
Right. Just because society is frustrated and wants a convenient, quiet place to dispose of incorrigible people doesn't mean the psychiatric hospital should serve as the dumping ground.
Exactly. He argued that psychiatry cannot cure a moral defect. Putting a swindler in a hospital doesn't make the swindler better. It merely ruins the hospital.
Wow.
His ultimate takeaway is a demand that society reforms its own criminal justice laws to handle individuals who fall into this gray area of partial responsibility. Psychiatry cannot be a magical rug that the legal system sweeps its complicated problems under.
Examining these century-old clinical texts, it is striking how much this deep dive mirrors the complex debates we navigate today. I mean, we are still constantly trying to find that precise boundary line between genuine mental health struggles, deep character flaws, and legal accountability. the diagnostic landscape remains deeply muddy.
It really does. And as our scientific tools become more advanced, the ethical and philosophical questions are only going to become more difficult to untangle, which brings up a final thought that builds on everything we've uncovered in these sources.
Lay it on us.
The word association experiment with the teenage boy proved that psychology could effectively bypass a suspect's conscious mind to extract a confession. The feeling-toned complex acted as a perfect cognitive tripwire.
It pulled the truth right out of his head before he could stop it.
Exactly. So, building on that historical precedent, we have to look at the trajectory of these tools. If we possess technologies, whether it was the stopwatch and stimulus words of the early 1900s, or, the advanced neuroimaging and biometric AI we are developing today, tools that can dig past our conscious defenses to reveal our hidden guilt, our suppressed anxieties, or our unexpressed thoughts.
Right.
At what point does diagnosing the mind cross the line into an invasion of cognitive privacy?
If the space inside your own head isn't safe from a diagnostic tripwire, where can you hide? It forces you to wonder, if science eventually provides us a perfectly clear window into human guilt, are we really prepared to deal with the messy, complicated realities it exposes? We will leave you to mull that over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.